Thanks everybody for attending. Tim and I have had a interest for some time in short stems and thought it might be an appropriate time as this concept sort of is emerging in the United States to talk about this. So my role is to sort of give some background and set the stage for the speakers that follow. And what I'd like to do is sort of define why anyone might even be interested in short stem uncemented devices. Summarize the results of the current sort of short stem devices that have actually been in the marketplace for a relatively short period of time. And then suggest some issues that we'll expect the speakers to address with regard to these neck stabilization devices, which, as Tim will sort of go into in detail, have been around for some time in Europe, but are now beginning to become available and evaluated in the United States, and is the subject of this symposium. Now, it's a little lag in the pickup. If you could, either this isn't working or I'll get it. I think it's important at the outset to acknowledge that cementless femoral stems of many designs provide dependable long-term fixation in virtually every patient, put in by surgeons with a wide range of experience and frequency of use, which in a way, if you think about it, is pretty remarkable. So that if your issue is fixation, then the discussion about short stems probably isn't something that'll be interesting to you or even appropriate. But there are, having established, I think, that you can achieve rigid long-term fixation with a variety of design concepts, a number of issues which I think deserve now attention. One of them is the preservation of proximal femoral bone. Another is the elimination of this proximal distal mismatch. Now, in a case like this, it's handy to have a short stem, but this isn't really the most frequent sort of occurrence of a proximal distal issue. This is more likely to be the issue. That is, for example, a robust male with a large metaphysis and a very narrow diaphysis. In this case, you have the issue reflected in this case, a case performed by a very experienced surgeon, a hip surgeon at Northwestern, in the course of doing a routine total hip in such a patient, where you can get a significant fracture as a result of this mismatch. And a number of authors, Dan Barry included, have begun to highlight this issue of the frequency of periprosthetic fractures in association with cementless devices. The issue that actually brought me to become interested in short stems a number of years ago, though, was the interest in the anterior approach and the recognition that the standard stems were not very accommodating to the emerging anterior approaches, which are and have been developing a following here in the United States and worldwide. So, to begin sort of looking at this issue of the short stem, it probably is worth spending a second or two thinking about what the stems do. Now, in a long stem device, particularly one that's porous coated, you get not only initial fixation, but subsequent fixation, both axially and rotationally. The AML is a device. What you end up having to sort of give into is that the proximal fit is dictated by the distal stem. And so the emergence recently of tapered stems has dominated the market. Now, these stems, by and large, don't achieve very much fixation distally, or not for very long, and you're relying on the characteristics of your proximal contact to provide you with both axial and, in particular, rotational fixation. So that when you go to thinking about short stems, I guess we're going to, thank you. When you go to think about short stems, where in fact you don't have any help from the diaphyseal portion of the device, you're having to pay attention to what's going on in the upper end of the femur with regard to the relationship of the implant to the bone, and hence a wide variety of design concepts are emerging with regard to this issue. A number of years ago, with this in mind, I sort of began looking at this, and in a pilot study, since I'd had a fair amount of experience with custom implants, basically decided that I would control my design of the proximal femur, that is the metaphysis, and just shorten the stem, knowing I could rely on at least the fit and fill to see whether, in fact, this stem could be shortened. And this is just how you do it. You get a CT scan, you make an implant. It was a pilot study. I had no real expectation that customs were the way to go here, but I did feel that in order to deal with this issue of fixation proximally, that knowing how you fixed it was helpful. We had DEXA scans that showed that load in the proximal femur when you did this was fairly reproducible and positive. And the results really were that, in fact, there seems to be a bit of a lag here, yeah, that the results were really, and these have been published, no different than the results from stems of conventional length. That is, that the recovery was about the same and really indistinguishable from conventional stems of conventional length. And in particular, if we could go back one, the radiographic results were encouraging in that, and in this initial series, I used them in younger patients with good bone, that the bone remodeling around these was encouraging. All of them were ingrown. That led to the development of an off-the-shelf device whose proximal metaphyseal geometry was very similar to the custom device. And over the last 5 years, I've been putting these in consecutively in all comers. It was a device that is very similar, but off the shelf, to the custom implant that we'd originally played with. And the results were identical to the custom. There was one intraoperative fracture that was recognized and cerclaged. There was one postoperative implant that subsided, slightly stabilized, and hasn't been revised. And the 2 revisions have been for acetabular related issues. And moreover, the radiographic results in the group as a whole has indicated that the bone remodeling around these is positive. You get ingrowth in virtually everyone, and that the implants remain stable. And in fact, in a subgroup of approximately 60 patients who are over the age of 70, and I was using these in all patients because, in fact, I think that has to be one of the requirements, since conventional length uncemented stems can be used in all patients. That is, in this group with predominantly door C-type bone, the ingrowth was equally good and the fixation was equally stable. This is sort of an extreme case where you can see I was pushing it. I used prophylactic cerclage wires. She sustained perioperatively that trochanteric fracture, which healed, and you can see 4 years later in this osteopenic patient with a short stem that the device has remained stable. We'll go back one. One of the issues that also has come out of this early experience, and that has been reported on with long stems, but is a particular issue which I think the presenters will address, and that is, as you shorten the stem, there's a potential for putting an implant in varus. So the question has to be asked, will varus positioning of these shorter stems jeopardize fixation because you don't have the stem down the diaphysis? And the answer, at least in these series, has been no. And it didn't really matter. This is the data on the patients over 70. It doesn't really matter either in terms of fixation or in terms of function, whether the implant is varus. That isn't to suggest that it should be done or that it's recommended, but it's worth knowing because that will be a consequence of going to shorter stems. So then the issue becomes, well, what about ingrowth around these metaphyseal engaging stems that I have sort of been playing with over these past few years? And it seems that it's variable, but the pattern is consistent in that most of the ingrowth